Hi, thanks for joining us for a new episode of Babes in Bookland. I'm your host, Alex Franca, and today I'm discussing Speak Okinawa by Elizabeth Miki Brina with my friend Nadia. Before we get to today's episode, here is a review from Apple Podcasts from Ren Ken Reads. I'm so grateful that pods like this that introduce stories about women by women on a platform created by a woman exists. It deserves all the support. Thanks, Ren Ken. We appreciate your support. Let's get to the episode. Hi, Nadia.
Hi, Alex.
Thank you so much for joining me today. All right, what did you think of Elizabeth's memoir?
This book has really stayed with me. I read it all the way through quite a while ago now and then revisited it before we started talking. But it reminds me, I heard on a podcast recently somebody say that sometimes the most powerful books are ones you don't even necessarily like, but they impact you and they stay with you and they change how you think. And I think this book is like that for me. I don't know that I liked it while I was reading it, but it stayed with me. Like it's really been compelling and impactful. And not to say that it's a bad book, but I felt myself upset at points and I felt myself challenged by things in it. And that is maybe more important than that I had a nice time reading it all the way through.
You say like, and people have a certain connotation for that word, but what I'm hearing is you didn't necessarily enjoy the experience of reading it, but it has left a lasting mark, an impression on you.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. That's what I'd say.
I completely agree. I was like 15 pages in because you had finished it before me, and I texted you and I was like, oh no, I'm already crying. Like that's not
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm a masochist with these books that I'm just constantly reading. These women's stories and journeys are so important. And you're right, they change us. Like we are changed at the end of reading some of these memoirs, especially this one. And what we can do with the information we get is something else entirely, which we'll talk about too. For me, this memoir is about identity. It's about the search for ourselves through our connections to our parents and their history, their baggage, their trauma, their hope, and ultimately coming to terms with who they are fully. It's also a heartbreaking account of the brutal history of the Okinawa people. And it was an education for me of honestly kind of the bullyish way that America has taken over and stayed on other people's lands. It was just something that I wasn't aware of. The fact that it's still happening is infuriating. It was a very emotional book for me, like I said earlier. So yeah, let's just get into it because we've got a lot to talk about today.
Let's do it.
Speak Okinawa was published in 2021. And this is Elizabeth's dedication to my mother and father.
The dedication is really simple, but for this book, it's actually incredibly profound, right? Like dedicating a book to your parents isn't surprising, but in this book, to my mother and my father, it's the core of the book.
It is. I know when you first read it, you're like, oh, okay, another child dedicating, her book to her parents. That's really sweet. And then after you read the memoir, you're right. You're like, oh, there's a huge weight to this.
Yeah, like the degree to which she means that is different than most books. And I actually really thought about that when you mentioned it again. I was like, oh yeah, this is a big thing here.
All right, Nadia, let's start with the quick topics. I loved how Elizabeth weaves in the beautiful and unique Japanese language where sometimes words can have different meanings. For example, she has a dog named Shiro, which means white or castle. And I just found that so fascinating. Did you grow up speaking Japanese, or was it something that you had to learn later in life?
Yeah, I didn't at all. My mom wanted our dad, who is Japanese, to teach us, and he read us novels when we were babies, which doesn't work. So we didn't learn anything. And then both my brother and I studied Japanese starting in college.
Wow, and you picked it up.
Yeah, it was not easy. It was a lot of work, a lot of years. We both also went to a Japanese Saturday school for a year or so when we were growing up, and we learned really basic counting and everyday phrases. But it was really just a year, and I don't know how much of that stuck with us.
Mm-hmm.
But we had that as a little bit of background.
And I know you're trying to have your son be bilingual as well. How's that
We're
going?
trying. Yeah. Trying to read him some Japanese books and just kind of have a little chit chat. And we have a lot of the same books in 2 languages.
That's cool. I really wish that I knew more than one language. I feel like it's so beautiful to be able to communicate with more people. I just have a hard time with them in my mouth, like the physicality of them.
I'm sure you could do it. But also I think that idea of like what is possible when you learn another language is also really central to this book, right? Like her ability to speak Japanese or not speak it really, in her eyes, shapes her relationship with the people in her life. So I
Yeah.
thought that that was such a key message here is how important that can be.
Yeah, and I loved how her relationship with learning Japanese changed. At first, it was something that she rebelled against and didn't want to welcome into her life. And now it's this thing that she feels shame that she can't speak and is working on it. And, that's just a part of growing up too. I think figuring out what's important and also cutting through societal and cultural expectations, which being a half Japanese woman growing up in America is very different than being a white woman growing up in America and all that goes with all that stuff. So, which we will get further into, but let's keep going. I loved learning this. According to Japanese legend, Elizabeth writes, if you make 1,000 paper cranes, you are granted 3 wishes. Do you know the history of this legend, Nadia? And if you didn't, did you research it?
I did try to research it. So I don't really know the history of it as a legend. I like cranes are significant for a long time and folding paper in like beautiful ways, long, long, hundreds of years of history in
Origami,
Japan.
right?
Yeah. So specifically origami is probably like the Tokugawa early modern era, but like the idea, like in the Tale of Genji, they're like folding notes in like intricate ways and how good you are at it is like a big deal. But the 1,000 cranes in particular, I don't know where the legend comes from or when it really started, but this idea became famous with a very specific book and person. So the book was published in the 1970s and it was called Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. And it is about a real girl named Sadako who was a victim of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima. And she, as a result of the radiation, had leukemia. And during treatment, one of her friends said, oh, there's this legend that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, you'll get a wish. And I guess this in this book, they say it's 3 wishes. So you get some number of wishes. And so she started folding the cranes. And in the book, she dies before she's able to complete it, but her friends and family complete this task.
Oh.
And I found out in researching this that apparently there's some debate and that her friends and family say that she actually did complete it. In any case, with the popularity of this book, the idea of these 1,000 cranes really took off globally. And so now even today in many places, but specifically if you go to Hiroshima, you will see these chains of 1,000 cranes that students or people or anybody who has a really heartfelt wish have made and kind of hung up on different monuments.
Oh my gosh, that's beautiful and really sad.
Yeah.
One day, Nadia, you and I will make 1,000 cranes. We'll make some wishes and we'll see what happens. How about that?
Yeah.
Okay, next quick topic. This is just a fun fact that I learned. Karate Kid 2 takes place in Okinawa because Mr. Miyagi is Okinawan, which I loved.
I had no recollection of that whatsoever. And there's like whole scenes where they're in Okinawa and it's like very important. I was just like, didn't remember any of this.
So cool. So cool. We have to revisit that movie for sure.
Yeah.
Elizabeth shares her first kiss story in the memoir. She's in 5th grade, and her schoolmates demand that she and another boy, a black boy, who Elizabeth writes is the 3rd black boy in their town, kiss. She writes, I close my eyes and lunge forward, but that's a mistake because girls are supposed to stand still. I bash his teeth with my teeth and bust his lip with my braces. They laugh at us. He dumps me the next day. And we'll get into more of Elizabeth's relationship with her peers and why this is a little bit heavier than just this first kiss story. But I wondered what your first kiss story was.
Oh man, this one is kind of heavy and dark, right? Her Elizabeth story.
Oh, okay. I was like, is yours too?
Oh no, mine really reflects what a like controlled, like careful kid I was. So my first kiss was on New Year's Eve 2000.
Okay.
At a New Year's party that a friend was throwing. And the person that I kissed was someone who was like a very nice, good person, but I didn't have any really strong feelings for him. It's not like we were dating. It was just kind of there. Just the idea that like at this big occasion and somebody that I'm like, this person checks out, like very good person, overall good choice. Like it was so considered. I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, just be a little less controlled. It's okay.
Nadia, I have a question for you though, because remember Y2K was happening. Like there was a lot of fear happening. Was it any part of you being like, in case the world is about to end, I want to have my first kiss?
I didn't have that like sort of like in case the world ends, but I did think like this is a momentous occasion. It's like appropriate to do. Like you can't just do this randomly. It has to be like pick a moment. And so
pretty
Just
badass that your first kiss was New Year's of the turn of the millennium. Like, that's pretty cool.
I know, but just I feel like I was so careful about all of my choices. And in a
Yeah.
way that pays off, right? Because it leads to fewer mistakes. But it took me a long time. Like it's taken me, I'd say decades to understand that it's okay to make some mistakes and that like you miss out on things when you're that controlled and that careful. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's my thought about that. Also, I want to hear your first kiss story.
For the listeners, I talk about my first kiss in Michelle Buteau's Survival of the Thickest, but I'll tell you and I'll just edit this out.
Minus the last part, it's like a lovely story, but
I
that
know
kicker really, yeah.
it kind of sucked, but yeah. Anyways, in her memoir, Elizabeth writes about the feminist spoken word artist, Maggie Estep, and she passed away in 2014. But I wanted to share her spoken word poem, Happy. This is as she performed it on Russell Simmons' Deaf Poetry Jam, because I actually was really into spoken word poetry when I was like 14 or 15 years old. Spoken word poet Big Papa E came to my summer camp and performed his poem, There's a Hole in My Heart in the Shape of Her Smile That Can Never Be Filled. And it was so powerful and it stayed with me. I'll link a performance of that in the show notes, but here's Maggie Estep.
This is called Happy. Thank you. I'm so grateful. Thank you. I don't know how I can convey how thankful I am. I'm bending over with gratitude. The sky is pouring itself down my throat because I'm wide open, because I'm so glad I'm happy. I wasn't always happy. In fact, I used to be a miserable wretch, but I realized this was an idiotic waste of time. I climbed out of the morass of love gone wrong and the fact that this world is not a fair place. I had to say fuck it to suicide, self-obsession, perverse maudlinism, and the acme of melancholy. To hell with sticking my head in the oven. I'm happy. I'm ridiculously, vengefully happy. I'm ripped apart by sunshine. I'm ecstatic. I'm leaping. I'm cutting off all my limbs. I'm doing circus tricks with forks. I'm breathing fire. I'm a radiant asshole and I'm happy. I've got joy shooting from the roots of my hair down to my violent red toenails. I'm happy to be here, to be alive, to be here, to be alive. I'm here, I'm alive, and I'm happy. Thank you.
Can't you just imagine little angsty Elizabeth being so into that?
Yes, totally.
I love it. I love poetry. I think that when you read a book of poems, it's a really beautiful way to get to know yourself and to get to know your feelings and emotions, but to see it live on stage, that was really powerful.
Yeah, she was incredible. I definitely feel like when I was younger, it made me nervous because it brought such big feelings and I was uncomfortable with them. So it took me a while to really like calm down and embrace poetry and embrace those performances because when they're good, they grab you so hard and like the emotions are so vivid and raw and immediate. And that just scared me when I was younger.
Yeah, I can hold the mirror up and you're just like, I'm not looking right now. I don't want to look in the mirror. Thank you, Elizabeth, for introducing us to Maggie Estep. It is time to dive deeper. We will start with Okinawa and we will end with Okinawa. First, we will start with Okinawa and Elizabeth's family, the history that her family endured there. Early on in the memoir, she writes about the Battle of Okinawa. It began in April of 1945 and lasted 82 days. Elizabeth writes, For 82 days, thousands of planes dropped hundreds of thousands of bombs on the island. Hundreds of thousands of troops invaded the island. 140,000 Okinawans, a third of the population, were killed. This does not account for those who died of injury, illness, starvation after the battle, or those who were forced to commit suicide. And we'll talk more about the violent history of the people of Okinawa and the island itself. But let's continue on to Elizabeth's direct line here. Her grandmother, Oba, was living by herself with her 4 children, Elizabeth's mother's older brother and 3 older sisters. Elizabeth's mother has not been born yet. Her grandfather is being held prisoner in Korea. She writes about how the sirens blared. Oba and her 4 children, ages 7, 5, 4, and 3, grabbed sacks of potatoes and things they had been storing for months and fled. They hid in caves while their home crumbled to ash. Somehow, her grandmother kept everyone alive. When her grandfather returned home from Korea, he was a different person, there, but gone. And reading this part, this was, I think, when I texted you, because she starts off the memoir right away, kind of telling you about her grandmother's journey. And when I think about the ages of those children, 7, 5, 4, and 3, and them having to flee and hide in caves. And she writes about how they basically all ate the same thing for 3 meals, potatoes and some sort of like dumplings or something, but it was just like potatoes, 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 because that's what they could grow. With what's going on in the world right now, like this is still a very real reality for so many families. And it's heartbreaking. And it feels like it's something, this happened in 1945 to her grandmother. And it feels like something that should be so dated, this thing that we should all have moved past from. And we just can't as a world.
In my history classes, I always try to both give students the big picture of these huge numbers, right? Like 140,000 people, you need to know the scale of it. But also, I think it's very hard to understand that and feel it because numbers are just so abstract. And so I also always pair that with really individual stories where someone's like, my beloved baby brother was starving and I got these weeds and we made whatever we could so they could eat. Because I think that personal, really specific story brings it home to you, makes you think about your own family, your own beloved people, and just the struggle of trying to feed your family and keep them safe and how important that would be and how hard it would be in these contexts. It stays with you in a different way than the number, and it maybe makes the number more real. I'm not even sure if it makes the number more real, but I think the really specific individual stories help you understand how horrific a big war is. It can be easy to sort of sum it up and have it feel like, well, I don't know, it just happened, and then the end outcome was this, and moving on, history is over.
The more personal you can make anything, the more that you can make somebody see themselves in that situation, I think the more it will resonate with them. I do think it makes it more real. Connecting people to real people and not having them be just a number. Victims of war are human beings, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, children, facing devastation and death, and they deserve more than just being part of a tally.
Yeah, and in my classes, the stories that we read about the Battle of Okinawa are among the most devastating. I mean, they are just unbelievable. I'll get into it if you want me to, but I mean, some of them, like I've assigned these dozens of times, and every time I read them and every time I think about them, tears come to my eyes because they're horrifying. She brings that into the book a lot, but I think it isn't as well known as it should be.
I had never heard of this before this memoir. Never.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common.
I think that's horrible too, but it makes sense because we're in America, and sorry, but America was the bad guy in this scenario so often.
Yeah.
I mean, so were Japan and China throughout different, points in history.
Definitely.
Okay, Elizabeth continues, these memories are impossible to forget, regardless of whether we actually lived through them. I believe they stay in our bodies, as sickness, as addiction, as poor posture or a tendency toward apology, as a deepened capacity for sadness or anger, as a determination to survive, a relentless tempered optimism. I believe they are inherited, passed on to us like brown eyes or the shape of a nose. Okay, so I read a lot of these memoirs. To me, I've never felt like such a thesis has been so apparent in a memoir, because like this is basically what she's proving throughout the rest of her book, I think. What do you think about that? Like, do you think that the traumas of our family, I mean, we'll kind of get into that a little bit more later, but she talks about it here, so we might as well. Do you think it stays in our bodies regardless of whether we've lived it or not?
I think this passage is really interesting to me and really stayed with me as well. It makes me think there's the book, The Body Keeps the Score. So there's this idea that trauma leaves its mark on you in all these different ways, and that you have to work through the trauma to be able to address those effects. And I do think that that can be passed on in a variety of ways. I don't know about like, she's kind of framing it as a sort of genetic thing, like an inheritance in a way that I'm not quite sure that's exactly how it works. But I think that idea that it shapes you and your family makes sense to me and seems true. The other thing that to me is so striking about this passage is that this is a book about a person who is mixed race and from two totally different cultures. So this gets complicated fast, right? Like how much trauma and how many different histories do we have to hold within ourselves and to consider and address? And I think that way in which she lays whole claim to these two different places is really central to the book. And it's also some of what I struggled with the most, that she fully speaks for and as an Okinawan person and for and as an American person. I find that difficult to wrap my mind around. So here it's such an interesting idea, and I think it's sort of true. And then when you combine this idea that we inherit this trauma with the fact that she has this very multiple identity, it's a lot. And I think you're right. That's exactly what the book is about, is that how much that is to hold and how hard it has been, and how we fail at it in so many ways and just keep trying, and maybe we get a little better.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting for me too, because my familial history, my ancestry pretty much on both sides is Eastern European. Like I don't have the this very big, distinct culture clash that happens within my family, even going back generations. And so to experience through her experience of being so torn, especially from one culture and country that seems to be very much of the victim and one culture and country that seems very much to be the aggressor, was so eye-opening. That internal battle. And she speaks about it so often. It's not only within herself and how she views herself, but like her internal battle with how she views her father, how she views her mother, the love that she accepts from them, and who they are, and which we'll get further into. As I read it, I was really glad that I'm speaking to you about the episode, because you come from two very distinct countries and cultures as well. And yeah.
Yeah, I do, but and it's actually three, right? So my mother was German, in the sense, like, not an American citizen, from Germany, grew up there, and my father was Japanese, and then I was born in America and grew up here. So it's sort of three different cultures.
Wow.
And on some level, Japan and the US, like, Japan lost the war and the US won. But I would still say that I experienced those because of the time. Like, my parents came to the US in the 1980s. Japan is not an underdog at that point, right? So I think there's some ways that I really connect with her experience. And then some ways in which, even though we're both half Japanese, half white people, they're totally different, right? Like, those halves are so different. So Germany, Japan, and America that's a lot of trauma to account for and a lot of harm caused to her.
Yes. Where did your family end up?
In terms of, like, where do we live now? Or
your location, because I think that also played a huge part in her, just the way that she saw herself. Like, her family ends up in North New York, where she is one of like 5 people of color.
Oh, yeah. So my parents moved to California, but then really what I remember growing up is living in St. Louis. We moved there when I was 6, and then that was my whole school life. And St. Louis in general is not sort of like super multicultural, but the specific place that we lived was a neighborhood that had very good schools, and it was close to Washington University, which is where my dad worked. So that specific school district actually did have people from all over the world, because if you were like a postdoc from Ukraine who was coming to work in this university, they would say, like, hey, you got to get your kid into this school. So my classes actually had a lot of people. And does that mean that there were a lot of half Japanese people? No, but there were like 3 girls in my high school, different ages, who were all half Japanese, who knew each other. And we sort of, like, we didn't like hang out all the time, but we had like a good feeling about each other, and did hang out sometimes. So
that's nice that you had that.
I felt different, but not like alien.
Okay. Yeah. And she definitely felt alien, I would argue. Yeah. So Elizabeth continues, I had not learned this history, my mother's history, my history, until I was 34 years old, which is to say I grew up not knowing myself. And thus begins her journey. She feels a lot of shame and guilt about her relationship with her mother, a lot of shame and guilt about not knowing Japanese, and guilt in not appreciating her extended family and their history when she could. There's a story that she recounts when she's about, I think she's 12 or 13, and she goes back to Okinawa for the summer, and she just like ignores her family the entire time. She's very Americanized at that point. She is an American, and she just wants to hang out in the one air-conditioned room and watch TV. She writes this about her grandmother. I wish I could have made her feel more welcome back then. Please stay with us, Oba, I would have said. My mother needs you. I need you. Teach me Japanese. I think she puts a lot of pressure on her adolescent self to like realize things that
totally,
like, as children, we just can't realize. It's like, you don't think, oh, this might be the last time I see my grandmother, even though okay, my grandmother lives halfway around the world and my mother hasn't been here in X amount of years. But you just like, time moves differently. The world works differently to you. And so that's one thing, is like, I felt so much compassion for her. And I felt like she didn't have enough compassion for herself through writing this.
I think one of the things that is really wonderful about this book is how clearly she articulates like that adolescent, like that you can't help, like you're saying, but the failure to grasp the significance of moments and to consider other people and consider consequences in these ways. She's so clear about that. And it does bring to mind so vividly your own experiences with that, times when you're like, yes, I wish I had understood this enough that I could have really been there for that person or really listened in this moment. But I also agree that she doesn't have the grace for herself yet, where I have those moments, but I'm often like, well, I was 14,
Yeah.
I know better now. What else can you do?
Exactly. Did you have a good relationship with your grandparents? Were you able to see them often? I know you had grandparents in Germany, grandparents in Japan.
Yeah, we were the satellites. Growing up, we didn't see them that often. It was very expensive to travel. And so my parents really did prioritize that. And we would like not have a lot of other things that could have been nicer so that we could save and do these trips. But even then, it's like maybe every 5 years we could go see grandparents. So the only grandparent I was really close to and knew well is the one who's still alive, who's my dad's mother. So my Japanese grandmother. The other grandparents I effectively met a couple times and I heard stories about them, but I didn't personally know them very well. So yeah, so there's a real distance there. So I felt her when she was talking about like you see them once every like huge amounts of time between the times you see someone. So it puts so much pressure on those moments, right? Like if you live near your grandparents, any one day doesn't make or break anything. But if you see them once every 7 years, like every single thing you do in that week that you're with them, huge significance. It stays with you for that whole next 7 years.
Yeah. How old is your Japanese grandmother?
She's 92 this year.
Wow.
Yeah.
What do you call her?
Call her Obasan, which
Oh,
is
okay.
it's basically the same word. And she is fantastic. So she's the grandparent I've gotten to know really well, but I'd also say that she's probably like just based on the stories I've heard, she's also the one that I would have always been closest to anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And who I really enjoy talking to. And I'm so grateful that I have this relationship with her and that I can connect with her. And like speaking to the themes of the book, learning Japanese myself made a huge difference in my ability to understand her on her own terms and to hear her stories from her without any filter and to know like just the rhythms, how funny she is, how like witty and wise and kind of wily. And you just don't get that when someone translates it for you.
Yeah.
So it's something I'm deeply grateful for that I was able to learn enough Japanese that I can understand her on her own terms.
Well, I look forward to going to Japan with you soon and meeting her.
She's very fun. She's got a great sense of humor and yeah.
That's awesome. That's so cool. Elizabeth writes this at one point in her memoir, and this was really sad, and this speaks to I think what you and I have just been talking about. She writes, "Oba, I am so sorry. I am so sorry for being so American. I am sorry for being afraid of you, ashamed of you. You who survived the Battle of Okinawa, which wasn't your fault. You who survived poverty, which wasn't your fault. You loved and took care of your children. You loved and took care of my mother. You gave her your blessing when she married an American and moved far away from you. You are dead now, but if I were to ever see you again, I hope I would have the courage to hold you tight, both your hands in mine, and say, Gomen nasai, I am sorry." I think we all go through those moments where we do feel ashamed, whether we can kind of pass it off as adolescent behavior or adolescent unknowing or not. You can't turn back the clock. You just can't.
Back to the quote about like, I'm sorry. I think you're right that she doesn't have grace for herself. And also like everybody knows that teenagers go through a phase where they're just embarrassed by everything that like at least their parents do, but not surprising it would go beyond that. That doesn't necessarily make it okay per se. Like I understand still wanting to say I'm sorry, but you know, it is not unheard of that a teenager is embarrassed by their family.
I think it is really beautiful, though, that she feels the need to apologize, and so she does, because that's a big part of her book too, is that she feels the Okinawan people need an apology as well. I think like apology and saying you're sorry and owning up to your bad behavior is like a big theme of the book as well. So she's leading by example, but I agree with you on all fronts. Now we're going to really get into what is the heart of the book, which is her relationship with her mother, Kyoko, and her father, Arthur. This whole memoir, like we've been talking about, is Elizabeth's journey to accepting, loving, and learning about her Okinawan heritage. To find that balance, to me, it seems, between her Americanness and her Okinawanness, to create a word. It's a love letter to her mother, an apology to her mother for not understanding her and pushing her away in Elizabeth's youth. And it's beautiful to see the messy metamorphosis that Elizabeth goes through. She lays it all out for us. It's very vulnerable, it's very brave, and it's very compelling. So let's talk about her father. He is an American, born in 1948 in Brooklyn, raised in Manhattan, the first child of wealthy Italian immigrant and an English-Irish Scotswoman who could trace her lineage back to Jamestown. So like a capital A American, if there ever was one. Her father is well educated, and he joins the military with good intentions. He wants to be courageous, be a hero, right wrongs, and stick up for the little guy. He writes, "He always made me feel safe and protected in this world." Throughout the memoir, she is conditioned, whether overtly or subconsciously, to view the half Japanese side of herself, the half Okinawan side of herself, as other, as bad, honestly. really, I mean, that's kind of what her classmates make her feel. I've already talked about how she's embarrassed and ashamed of her mother. And so she attaches herself to her father, her American white father, who symbolizes everything that's like right with the culture and the world, right? And she writes, he will help me be like him, a cultivated American. He will protect me, prevent me from becoming more like her, an outcast, an interloper. He doesn't understand, and I don't either. I won't for a long time. How his rearing of me will complicate how I see myself, how I see my mother, and distance me from her further.
Some of these quotes just really capture the enormous disconnect between children and their parents, and especially when they're combining cultures in this way or moving across the world in this way. So this is something that I have felt, but in a less sort of, I don't know, sad or traumatic way. But like my parents' experience of the world and their growing up and mine are so totally different. And there are just like funny moments where we notice how different we are in our kind of fundamental understanding of the world and things that are just like automatic to them and automatic to me. And I think for her, there's so much sort of like power dynamic to it, and she feels so much regret about it. I have a little bit less of that, but I do understand that being raised by two people who are like, you are fundamentally different than I am.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all resonate with that. Her father treated her mother with a lot of love and respect, but there was this unspoken expectation that she bend her life to fit into his. It wasn't a melding of their two cultures by any means, which is why it gets so complicated, because it's not what she's necessarily seeing being said out loud. It's the way that the relationship plays out and how your actions can speak so much louder than words.
Yeah, and I think it's that underlying assumption that America and American culture is better, that he doesn't have as a sort of like arrogant or explicitly negative thought. It's baked in this really deep way that she's articulates really beautifully, right? Like her father is trying to be a good person in the way that he understands, but part of that understanding is that his way is best.
Yeah. Ethnocentrism.
Ethnocentrism, when you see a word like that, you assume that it's sort of like overtly negative or hateful. And this is a person who is being loving, but the way that he is doing that actually includes an assumption that the person he loves is inferior.
Yes.
And that's much more complicated.
Much more complicated, especially when like she looks in the mirror and she looks more like her mother than her father. And so what does that make her think about herself? But overall, like we've been talking about, she really loves her father. And she writes, his voice gave me strength, motivation to carpe diem, how his voice gave me comfort, reassurance that my mistakes weren't so bad or consequential. I remember the countless times I called him sobbing, anxious, on the verge of panic at 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. He always answered.
I think this book does this really beautiful job of holding the kind of idea that I think therapists say this a lot, but two things can be true, right? Like her father has some beliefs that she finds deeply disturbing, that that she totally disagrees with. And at the same time, he was a loving father who has always been there for her, who is doing the best he can in the world as he understands it. And she doesn't really pardon him for thoughts that she, finds reprehensible or negative or incorrect.
His racism and his bigotry. Yeah.
Yeah, she portrays him lovingly at the same time. But I think that's pretty hard to do. And I think this book does it remarkably well.
He's very honest with the way that he thinks, and they get into discussions and arguments about it. And she writes, writing it feels like a betrayal because he is my father and he means so much more to me than his bigotry. And then towards the end of the memoir, Elizabeth provides a justification, for lack of a better word, for why she feels her father is this way. She writes that he grew up believing one thing and then being in a war that gave him, he was in the Vietnam War, and that gave him PTSD, which she later discovers a doctor had diagnosed him with, but he felt he had no right to file for government assistance because so many of his friends had died in the war, which is really, really sad.
I would say in a way that she's not necessarily justifying, but she gives you a lot of context for him, right? So that you can understand this is a man who wants with all of his heart to do what is right and good. And then he's in a war where it is absolutely impossible to determine what is right and good. And so he's just completely off his axis. This is just one little piece of it, but you see all the ways in which his life led him to where he is, and that doesn't necessarily make it okay, but you just gain understanding. And she gives you that opportunity to try to understand, which isn't the same thing as forgiving or excusing, I think.
Yes, justification is the wrong word. You phrased it perfectly. And you're right, there is a huge difference between understanding and forgiving.
But I think this whole dynamic of how she describes her father and their relationship really made me think that now as a parent, I mean, this is why, and this is such a like trite phrase, but it's why you have to put your own oxygen mask on first, right? Like if you are not working on yourself and trying to really think about who you want to be and how you want to be and kind of taking care of yourself, if you don't do that, you will pass it on to your children no matter what, right? Like it doesn't matter like if you say a thing, it's what you do and how you are. Your kids will pick up on that. And so if you want to pass on to them a different way of looking at the world or a different way of feeling, you have to really change yourself. You can't just say different words to them and think it's going to come across.
I completely agree with you on all of that. A way to kind of just wrap up this section on her dad, Elizabeth writes, "My father taught me love and kindness. For that, I am grateful. I will always be grateful. However, over the years, I began to realize how dependent I was on his teaching, his love, a love that could never be matched, both a blessing and a curse. I began to realize how much easier it was for him to teach me in his country, his native language, and for all the lessons he had learned and taught me, why didn't he learn and teach me Japanese?" So her mother lived a very different life than her father, as I've sort of alluded to. She quit school before she finished 8th grade to work in a factory until she was 16 and worked as a waitress in a nightclub. This is where she eventually met Elizabeth's father. Elizabeth returns to this phrase a lot when describing her mother. Working hard with her body was all she knew. And she ends up working in restaurants for the rest of her life. She is at a nightclub in Okinawa called the Blue Diamond when she meets Elizabeth's father. So at this point, Okinawa had become known as R&R Island, a place for troops to relax and recuperate between stints in the war. Her father stationed there after he fought for 4 years in Vietnam. And Elizabeth writes this: "Perhaps someone who had grown up eating sweet potatoes for every meal, sleeping in the same room as her mother, father, and 6 siblings, he must have seemed like a way out. Perhaps to someone who had just spent 4 years in combat, she was too vulnerable to resist. He had to save her." Her mother and father get married, and she writes, "When I asked my mother why she decided to marry my father, she says because he was very handsome and polite and left big tips. She says he was different from the other soldiers. He didn't swear, he didn't start fights, he didn't tease or grab, he didn't take without asking. She said she always wanted to get off that sad, poor island, get away from her sad, poor family." I wanted to include that little bit about the way that Elizabeth's mother saw her father as a soldier, because we'll get into a little bit later. There were a lot of instances of murder and rape and sexual assault that the American soldiers would do to the Okinawan people. And so just continuing to paint that picture that like Elizabeth's dad stood out in a good way in her mother's eyes. Elizabeth's mother now admits that she isn't sure if she ever truly loved Elizabeth's father at the time, but now at the end of the book and the end of kind of Elizabeth's journey with writing this book, she does. Sometimes I have to remind myself that like marrying for love is still kind of like a new modern concept.
Yeah, where it is fundamentally an economic decision and you're trying to find somebody who is a good partner, but not necessarily in that like best friend, romantic partner, economic part, like all of it. Another thing I noticed that I didn't realize when I was reading is that in that quote where she's talking about why her mother got married, you can tell that her mother sees Okinawa as a sad, poor place. And so some of Elizabeth's attitude towards this place is actually probably from her mother, which I don't think she accounts for, maybe. She blames herself almost entirely for having a bad view of Okinawa, but it didn't come from nowhere.
Right. So Elizabeth's parents get married and they go to America. Elizabeth writes, "Back then, my mother believed she could have both her life in Okinawa and her life in the United States. My mother has seen her mother 3 times in the 45 years since she left." She writes about reading out loud to her mother when she's 4. And her mother says, "You don't need me." And Elizabeth writes, as she said this, it was bitter and accusing. "I didn't bother to deny it. For a long time, I thought my mother was weak because she couldn't speak English very well or read, because she was afraid of pools and neighbors, because she got drunk and sobbed unconsolably and had to be carried, sometimes dragged, to bed." She continues, "I didn't realize then that she couldn't change history, that history wasn't her fault, that she could never escape the legacy of defeat, of trauma, perpetuated by her very own husband and daughter, that I could never escape either. Now, whenever I try to comprehend her loneliness, I am completely overwhelmed by her strength. She must have longed for that small child in the photographs. She must have ached from missing me." Which, when I first read this part, I don't know if you've experienced this because you have a little boy. So many people already are like warning me of the teenage years when my daughter will not like me, And so like, even though this book was from Elizabeth's point of view and like I resonated with her, my heart broke so much for her mother because my daughter and I not having a close relationship for the rest of our lives is such a huge fear of mine, warranted or not, that could get, I'm getting emotional thinking about it right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so happy that they found their way back to each other at the end of this memoir. That's kind of what this whole memoir is, an apology to her mother, basically.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think she's so vivid about this dynamic between her and her mother. And I really felt it. And these kinds of stories crush me, like stories where the parent just like tried their heart out and the kid was like, nope. And like the kid has no understanding of how crushing that is. Like my mom told a story about her mother, like not being able to afford a like beautiful communion dress, but like doing everything in her power to make her the most beautiful thing that she could, like using every skill and spending all this time. And that she was just like so disappointed and like embarrassed because it wasn't like a store-bought something. And that kind of story where I'm like, oh, your mom tried so hard. It crushes me. But also I think the way I think about this comes back to that like put on your own oxygen mask thing, where what I really hope is not so much that my child will see me in any particular way, right? Like I'm interested to know what my child eventually, how they see me, but they don't need to see me in any particular way for me, right? Like I want him to know that I am complete unto myself. Like he doesn't owe me anything. He doesn't need to do anything for me. He exists for himself, that I am okay. And I think if you have that sense of like, I am okay, and I am just fascinated and interested to see like what this child becomes and does, that there might be these cycles where like you are, like a little baby snuggle, and that sense of like, you're their world and they turn to you for everything and they trust you so much is incredible and so wonderful. And I can imagine her mother missing that. I can imagine myself missing that, even though I have it right now. But it is not good to have that forever, right? Like your child has to go out into the world and be their own person and separate from you. And that is a cycle that is normal and okay. And then they come back around.
But no one can prepare you for this.
Totally. But like, if you think about it, like if your daughter is like, I hate you, you're still incredibly important to them, right? They're mad at you because you matter.
That's true. I had an old acting coach that said the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hate is
I
still a
think
very powerful emotion.
And I had that with my mom a little bit, where like I remember when I was working, even like much older, every day when I was walking home, I would call her and tell her about my day. And then she would say something that I'd be like, that's the wrong thing to say. And I'm super annoyed and I would get mad at her. But every single day I would call her, right? Like she annoyed me with what she said almost all the time. And I always still turned to her to tell her what was going on. So it isn't necessarily that your relationship has to be perfectly smooth and like loving at all times. You could still be very important. To me, that's okay. And I think if you're an adult who's okay with yourself, you don't need your child to be like performing how much they love you at all times. There's something wrong if you need that from your child. And so I hope to not do that. And I think you can see that her parents, their struggles for themselves shaped their relationship with her, right? Like, what if she had chosen her mom instead of her dad and had been like totally codependent with her mom and the only one who showed her mom like love and safety and whatever? That's also not good.
Right.
Like, I want for her mom to not be lonely and to have love and to feel that her daughter cares about her and respects her. But, it's still tough. It's not necessarily the case that if she had like shown her mother all the love that she needed, that it would have been good for her to try to fill that hole in her mother's life.
Oh man, Nadia, this is what you just said is really making me pause and reflect about my own relationship with my parents and the duty of love that I feel. I'm going to have to sit with this for a little bit. This is going to stick with me. I do know that I really don't want to ever put that burden on my children.
The way that you interact with your children is so filled with curiosity, like the openness, right? Like you just want to see what they love, what they want to do. And that is a totally different thing than when you need your child to be like, look how close my child and I are. Look how much she loves me. Like you just love them and let them be.
Yeah, you're so right. Getting back to Elizabeth and her mother, she kind of goes into giving us context, stealing your word, for why she feels so disconnected from her. And one of the big things is language. And so this obstacle of non-communication causes a huge divide between Elizabeth and her mom. They literally didn't understand each other. Of course, Elizabeth's mother does speak English, but it's broken English. It's, she would embarrass Elizabeth. She writes, eventually I realized that the world is certainly big enough for her English, for all Englishes, for all the languages and dialects, each one another history, another journey, another map by which we discover ourselves. Eventually, I realized that it is my responsibility to understand her, not her responsibility to make herself understood. but it took too long. Okay, I'd love to hear your thoughts because I really love that quote. But I will say I bumped a little bit on, I realized it was my responsibility to understand her, not her responsibility to make herself understood. I don't know if I quite agree with that.
Yeah, me neither. I was like, I don't know that it's entirely your job to understand your parents. Like communication just fundamentally doesn't work that way, right? Like
Yeah.
you have to have more than one person to communicate. I didn't have that dynamic that I think a lot of children of immigrants have where either their parent does speak to them in another language and they understand it for a long time, but they don't ever speak back. So they'll speak back in English. There's a sort of rejection there that happens a lot. Or not infrequently, immigrant parents choose not to teach a language because they want their kids to be fully part of American culture. The parent made that choice, but then the child is like, I'm so disconnected from you. Like there's a whole side of you I can't understand. My parents like sort of meant to teach me their languages and then didn't. And my brother and I both chose to study German and Japanese. And I just really loved learning languages, but I did choose those, even though I didn't do it in my mind to understand them or to understand their cultures. Like I picked those. There's not no connection. I think some part of me wanted to.
Yeah.
And then I will say, like, I wish I could say it didn't matter that much, but I think it radically changed how well I could understand them. My German is not perfect, but I could still understand how different my mom was with her own siblings and her family. And I could see how she fit in. And Elizabeth has a moment like that where she suddenly sees her mom talking to Okinawan people in Okinawa and her family. And is like, oh my God, you're like so smooth and confident, and just sees her so differently. And I've kind of had that experience. Being able to understand my parents in their own original languages really did make a huge difference. The funny thing for my dad is that he is sometimes hard to understand in English, and I always assumed it was because he has like a pretty significant accent. And then I saw him talking to his brothers in Japan, and they were like, "What are you trying to say?" And it turns out he just mumbles in every language. But I wouldn't have known that, you know? I 100% remember at 11 years old suddenly realizing that my parents had accents and I had not been able to hear it. And they're like significant accents. You wouldn't normally miss it, but I just didn't, I don't know, I didn't hear it. I didn't know. Didn't matter really. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I do think, I don't know what really to make of this idea that it's her responsibility to understand her mother. I'm not sure about that. I didn't feel that way, even though I did try to learn these languages and I did think it made a big difference. But sometimes when my parents are like, man, you sound like an American, like, yeah, that's your fault. Let's be clear. Like you could have done something about this and you didn't. So I'm doing my best.
I like the idea that it's our responsibility as humans to try to understand each other, but I think it's also our responsibility as humans to try our best to be understood. Like, I think it's a 50-50 meet in the middle type situation. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of feelings that Elizabeth is still working through when she's writing this memoir. And with time comes even more reflection and even more peace. So I hope she's found a little bit more peace with that. From a very young age, she realizes that her mother is not like the others in their upstate New York city of Rochester. She has trouble making friends, is hardly noticed at school, except, she writes, sometimes some of my classmates stretch their eyelids with their fingertips and sing the song We Are Siamese from Lady and the Tramp. I don't understand that this is racist. I'm not yet aware of the damage this daily teasing will cause. Seems harmless because being ignored and belittled isn't so bad. I am not feared or hated or oppressed. There are a few more heartbreaking instances of her being bullied. At 9, she will make friends, in quotes, who call her names and treat her badly, and they end up stealing a bunch of things from Elizabeth's family, a diamond necklace, 3 large vases of coins that her mother's had saved up, years of tips, and cash from her secret wallet. Elizabeth writes, I don't care because I already learned that people like me, and especially people like my mother, aren't important. At 9 to think that about yourself.
This is making me think of one time my dad did talk to me about his experience about living in St. Louis. So he's a Japanese man. And I don't know what context this came up, but he talked about how the whole time he was there, if he was in a store, nobody would ever like make eye contact or talk to him. Like they would just all avoid him.
Wow.
So like in this way, like they were like, no. Well, like maybe he won't speak English. Like we don't know. We're just gonna like avoid. And like if he asked somebody something, they wouldn't like, I don't think he ever had somebody be like, I'm not going to talk to you, but they just sort of like were nervous and wouldn't say like, how can I help you? But again, to that like idea that if it does also matter what your parents' relationship with themselves and their experiences, because I think he noticed that, but he was also just like, whatever, idiots. Like he had kind of his own, like, I don't care. It's actually kind of nice that you're not talking to me. I don't want to chat with the store person. He didn't internalize that. And so then I think also I didn't internalize that. So I sort of knew that sometimes people like didn't consider him as others, but that wasn't like something that he accepted as correct.
Yeah, because that's definitely very much what I think is happening to Elizabeth. She accepts their opinion of her as the right opinion, and she accepts her mother's feelings of herself and the self-hatred and the self-loathing and the loneliness as all these things that she takes onto herself.
Yeah, and I don't know if her mother like thought that she was specifically lesser, but she doesn't fight back against, like there's just a way in which Elizabeth is taking some cues from her and then also kind of just disregarding her because she understands American culture and her mother doesn't really.
Her mother also gets drunk, mostly on her days off, and it's horrible. Her father ends up having to restrain her, and she's always trying to escape their home, yelling that she wants to go back to Okinawa. Elizabeth writes, "We stand guard and watch her together, making sure she doesn't leave. Because even though I don't want her to be my mother, I don't want her to leave. We stand guard and watch her together until she whimpers herself to sleep." And she reflects on these incidents, writing, "I wish I had crawled into bed with her, told her not to worry, told her that I am her daughter, I am home. I wish I had been on her side as she always was on mine."
That's a lot.
It sounds like Elizabeth wishes she had been able to like mother her mother. Elizabeth writes, "We never uttered the word alcoholic, or maybe our denial came from a deeper, darker place. What would happen if we removed the booze? If my mother didn't have it as a means to make herself visible to us, vulnerable to us, to divulge her secrets? If my father didn't have it as a reason to nurse and look after her? If I didn't have it as an excuse to resent and look down on her? What would happen if it were just the three of us? What would we have to face about each other, about ourselves? Maybe we were afraid to admit that none of us has the resolve or inclination to replace the booze, that my father and I weren't willing to be there for her the way she needed, to love her the way she needed, that the pain she was trying to numb was partially our fault." There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack in this little passage. I think it's a really interesting question, but I think alcoholism is a disease and it is not something that is easily solved or easily solvable because it's such an intrinsic psychological, emotional, physical. But it is an interesting question because alcoholism has touched my life and I've never thought about this. Like, I think you and I will agree that it is not Elizabeth's responsibility to take on, but these are really interesting questions. And it also just, for me, is a bigger question of like the behavior that we allow people to get away with in our lives, because dealing with it or asking them to deal with it is definitely a harder path to take.
Yeah, and there's an interesting way that she's describing how her mother's like very kind of intense alcoholic episodes where she would just like drink an enormous amount and be like completely non-functional, and her father's physically holding her on the bed so that she doesn't, like harm herself or do other things. They're really like extreme, these like kind of cataclysmic moments, and she's describing how that functions in the family. And this is a little bit of a departure, but it reminds me of somebody I worked with once whose work pattern was that she would create a crisis. Like she would like wait until something was like a huge crisis mess. And the reason she liked that is because in a crisis, you can kind of override all these other rules and like they don't apply because it's like, this is an emergency. We got to just like cut through the tape and do XYZ. And this person had just gotten used to that as a way of working. So she would create these crises when it was unnecessary. But in a way, it seems like that's how Elizabeth is describing what her mother was doing, is that she couldn't ask them to take care of her day to day.
Sober.
Yeah, but if she had like a complete breakdown, they would show up for her. They would both be there and they would like take care of her in that moment.
And prove their love?
Yeah. Like
Question mark?
And it's the only way that she could sort of demand their attention and care. And it's a very dysfunctional way of doing that. But I think that's what Elizabeth is describing, is like, this is what it did. And we weren't able to have a conversation that would allow anybody to do this in a more healthy way. And so instead we'd have these like sort of boom and bust cycles of like mostly disregarding her and not treating her like she mattered. And then in these like crisis moments, both of us devoted all of our time and attention to making sure she was okay.
Yeah, definitely. And then she writes that something shifts inside of her during one of her mother's drunk episodes when she's older. And Elizabeth writes, "For some reason, right then, I felt old enough to take care of her, take responsibility. When I looked under the table," because that's where her mother had gone, she got drunk and then went under the table, "I didn't see my mother. I saw me. I saw a woman hurting. I saw a woman fighting to be acknowledged and understood, fighting to matter. Sometimes in real life, change can happen in an instant. This pain, this change, this epiphany of connection, that her trauma is my trauma, that our pain comes from the same source. This change is permanent, but sometimes at first it doesn't last. It goes away and comes back, and goes away and comes back." She continues, I ask myself how I can make this right. I tell myself this guilt is not her fault. I tell myself maybe, just maybe, because this guilt is too much, maybe this guilt is not entirely my fault either. Maybe it starts before me. Maybe it starts before my mother. Elizabeth has so much compassion for her mother, and I don't think it always goes this way. I mean, I think Elizabeth is a very special person for being able to turn inward and self reflective about this and wanting a new relationship with her mom because it seems like a different path than I think some people take, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
And maybe learning about the Okinawan history too and realizing, like, whoa, that's what my mother's mother experienced. Like, that's what my mother experienced growing up. Like, I feel like would see my parents in very different light if like they had such a traumatic historic past like that. But there's something that happens to her through her early adulthood where a flip switches and she starts to see her mother in a different way.
Yeah, I think there's a point a little bit later on where she articulates the relationship between that flip in herself and like kind of a flip in world attitude, maybe, or like American attitude. Interestingly, like that there is a long period in her life where weakness is so bad, right? Like it's just like bad and embarrassing and she doesn't want to be associated with it. And then as she gets older and learns more about it, overt power and strength is a little bit bad. She talks about the two halves of herself and the one that like is the kind of victor and the strong, and then that side of herself. She talks about like American history and she claims both, right? Like she claims the Okinawan history, claims the American history. So she owns also the imperialist and the aggressor in the war and the arrogant one who has all these military bases. She takes that on herself as well. But she talks about how that self also likes to use the other half of herself as a shield to say, but not me. I'm not the bad one. And so there's like an interesting way in which there's like a societal shift that kind of relates to her shift in how she sees her mother and how she can reevaluate what it meant to be from Okinawa and that history. And I really like was compelled by the way she talks about the two parts of herself warring, and the way she tries to claim both is very interesting to me. And that for me is very challenging, the idea that she fully claims both. The way that she talks about throughout the book, she weaves in these episodes of Okinawan history and she says like we, you know, like we did this, this happened to us. And I just had such a reaction to that where I was like, can you do, like, are you going to speak for all of Okinawa? I would never try to speak for all of Germany or all of Japan or even all of America. And like that aspect of her writing where she says that about Okinawa, and then at some point midway through the book she also does it for America. She like drops the other shoe. And I was like, oh, okay, you're going to do both. I get it. But I felt so uncomfortable with that. I'm still thinking about it.
Well, I think part of her journey to like loving and understanding, like accepting herself is loving and understanding and accepting the Okinawan part of herself and like sticking up for them before she had been ashamed of that part of herself. And so now taking their pain on and being the collective we was sort of how I took it, of her being like, I stand with them now. Like these are my people, you know?
Yeah, I think that is what she's doing, but it still made me uncomfortable because she simplifies it a little bit, right? Like she very much describes the early Okinawan people as these sort of like idyllic, perfect, like people who don't have conflict. And then others come in and create conflict. And I'm like, this is just noble savage, right? Like they weren't timeless. They certainly fought with each other. They were human beings. Like they had society. There were power dynamics. They weren't perfect. So there's a little bit of like, I think simplicity to the way that she takes on Okinawa and speaks for Okinawan people, that part of it is just the like mixed race person in me being like, I'm uncomfortable saying that I'm fully a part of anything. And part of it is also just like, this is a pretty simple version of Okinawan history that you're telling with like no caveats, which any historian would be like, no, you gotta have lots of caveats and footnotes.
I definitely see what you're saying. I think she's deliberate in what she chooses to tell us. And maybe these are the aspects of their history that had the most effect on her. At the end of the day, this is all through her perspective as a young woman grappling with the difficult past of a part of herself that she used to feel ashamed of.
I admire the move to claim both and to do that. I think is really interesting to me. And to say I'm fully both of these things. Like I am the aggressor and the one who is the victim at the same time. And I have to somehow account for that.
It's not easy to own the dark parts of ourselves or own the dark parts of our country and society. We see examples of that happening right now. The erasure of our mistakes and our failures, the hiding of our history. But you can't change history, and the effects seep out individually in the way that you think about yourself and your behaviors or the behaviors that you accept. And this is the personal journey that Elizabeth is on. While she's having these like realizations about her mother and who her mother is and her history, her mother's also becoming happier, which is really interesting because you've talked about this. She's found this community, the Japanese Christian church, and she decides she wants to get baptized, and Elizabeth goes home for the baptism, and Elizabeth understands that her mother is like fitting in and like finding herself and feeling comfortable with herself. And I think the world also opens up to Elizabeth. She writes about moving to Oakland, and this is the first place that she experiences true diversity. The population at that time was 18% Asian, which is a more wonderful place for her to be than like 0.001%, right?
Yeah.
She talks about race for the first time in her life with people casually, she writes, and seriously as a matter of importance. And just their mere presence puts her at ease. She writes, I realized that a lot of time I felt like an oddity, a curiosity. Oakland is the first place where I experience the power of visibility, of majority, where I feel seen rather than exposed.
I have had the feeling like moving to South Carolina for a job, I was like, oh, I'm going to go back to being an oddity. And I certainly did. You know, like people will kind of stop you and you just know that they want to ask, like, what exactly are you? But they like are trying to find a polite way to do that. Very accustomed to that conversation.
Elizabeth has that exact story where somebody's like, where are you from? And she's like, I'm from New York. And they're like, no, but where are you from? And she's like, well, my mother's from Okinawa, Japan. Like, that's what you mean. As a way of dealing with the way that she was feeling about herself and her mother and her family life at home, she turned to the physical affection from boys growing up. And she starts having a lot of sexual experiences that don't really serve her in a very positive way. Later in life, she meets a man, Kendall, and she falls in love, but it's really tricky. He's white. He takes her back to Kansas City at one point, wants to move there, and she literally breaks out in hives because she has a physical reaction to once again becoming the other. And they decide to move to New Orleans once she gets into the MFA creative writing program there, and it's better. But then when they're taking a trip across Europe and then they're ultimately supposed to meet her parents in Japan, they end up canceling their wedding.
She describes herself as demanding a lot of certain kinds of proofs of his love, like that he had to prove it to her over and over again. And I think empathy fatigue is a little bit of it. And it's also just like fatigue with like, I feel like I should have proven it to you by this point, that there has to be like sort of a trust that the other person loves you that she's not able to get to. And so that's some of the tension as well. And she describes that really, I think, effectively, where she's sort of like on a journey. And by the end of this relationship, she's kind of starting to understand that she needs to be in a relationship in a different way, but she's not there yet. So this particular relationship kind of can't be saved, but that's okay.
Yeah. I think they're both very adult about the situation instead of just like moving forward because they had everything booked. I mean, she talks about not getting the deposits back. And then so she goes on to Japan with her family, and her mother and father are kind of retaking this trip. They stop in Okinawa and then they go back to Japan, which is where they had their honeymoon. And so they're retaking this trip with Elizabeth. She writes this, I start to wonder about the reasons, the many reasons why I am who I am, and that maybe a few of those reasons are greater than the sum of my actions, greater than me. I start to ask myself questions about my mother, about everything that had happened to her to meet and marry my father, about their marriage, about being their only child, their only daughter. I start to try to explain myself to myself. Sometimes those reasons hurt, sometimes those reasons comfort, sometimes I forgive myself. I think asking these questions of ourselves can be challenging, but ultimately freeing. Why are we the way we are? How do we become who we want to be? What work do we need to do to get there? About her relationship with her mother, she writes this. I wish I could locate a precise point of transformation, the pivotal moment when my mother and I finally reconciled, but that's not how we apologize and forgive. The healing is gradual, cumulative. It happens as we begin to recognize our mothers, not as mothers, but as women who endure husbands and daughters. It happens as we begin to accept and appreciate our very own exquisite uniqueness and everyone we hold responsible. It happens now as I write.
I think that's such a beautiful passage, and the way that she talks about writing and how I think she really makes it clear that this writing is a process through which she's understanding herself, which just speaks to like the whole podcast is about like these various women who've written about their lives and how important it can be to do that. And maybe not everybody uses writing to do that, but that there's so much understanding you can gain of yourself through that kind of process.
Yeah.
And that it isn't finished at the end of writing it, that maybe you've pulled some part of it, but like, you know, there's more.
Yeah, always more. That's the memoir. But I do want to take just a little bit of time to speak about Okinawa, the island, the heartbreaking history. Like you said, she writes all of these chapters in the we tense, fully claiming her Okinawan ancestry. And I want to just go through a few of them. We don't have time to talk about it all, even though it's such an important truth. I'm really just taking from Elizabeth's chapters, big bullet points. In 1879, Okinawa's last king was banished and exiled, and they officially became a part of Japan after many decades of kind of doing Japan and China's bidding against one another.
Like they also benefited economically from this. So like there's some truth to the subjugation, but they're also like more savvy than she's giving them credit for. Like my understanding is that they sort of played these two powers off of each other.
Okay.
In a way that like to some extent the tail could wag the dog. Didn't always work out that way. But they're not sort of these like naive, pure, simple people who are subject to, big people pushing them, big countries pushing them around entirely. Early history, I wouldn't say that that's what's happening, but there is a point at which Japan just claims Okinawan as their own, and the rest of the world is like, is anybody going to object? No? All right, that's yours. And it's just like, is Japan's.
Wow.
And then the US is occupying Japan and then occupies Okinawa. So it's like doubly subjugated in that way. And so it's been returned to Japan, but there's still these bases. And so all of that, I would say, like very much Okinawa had no say in any of that. And if you ask a lot of Okinawan people that there's a lot of protest against that, different in the modern period.
Yeah, there's a lot of continued protests today. Yes. So, okay, brief history. In 1945, she writes, the Americans burned all our land, crushed all our land. The Americans killed 140,000 of us. And I did do a little research to corroborate what she's saying, and the number is believed to be between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan citizens. So what she writes falls into this scope. And I do just want to clarify, these were citizens, not soldiers. I talked about this at the beginning. This is what her grandmother experienced. In 1951, the Emperor of Japan and President Truman signed the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty, in which the agreement was made, like you just said, that the use of portions of Okinawa would be leased to the U.S. military for 99 years. During a visit in 1953, Vice President at the time, Richard Nixon, declares, as long as communism is a threat, the United States will hold Okinawa. They used land to build a fortress to protect the, quote, free world, a world in which Okinawa is not included. In 1972, Okinawa reverted, or was rather sold back to Japan for the sum of $685 million. Since 1972, nearly 9,000 crimes, including murders, arson, theft, rape, and sexual assault, have been committed by U.S. military personnel stationed in Okinawa. Elizabeth lists the atrocities that happened to the Okinawan people, children, women, families from 1951 to current day, including many instances of murder and rape where American soldiers go unpunished, just sent off the island free. In 1996, in response to outrage, the Japanese and U.S. governments agreed to close the Futenma Air Station on the condition that the base be relocated to the north, pristine area of Hinoko. Their plan is to build an artificial peninsula in Ora Bay, the home to blue coral reefs and many sea animals and mammals, including the dugong, only 10 left in Okinawa. In 2016, after several rulings and appeals and re-rulings and re-appeals, the Supreme Court of Japan concluded that erecting 76,000 concrete pillars and seawalls, then dumping 21 million cubic centimeters of sand and soil into Ora Bay would not have an environmental impact. Today, 20% of Okinawan land mass is still controlled by the U.S. military, more land controlled by a foreign military than any other nation. And Elizabeth writes this: America, you spend more money on military than half the world combined. America, why? Who threatens you? America, you are dumping sand and soil into our ocean, not for our defense, not for our protection, America. It's not too late. No matter how far you've gone down the wrong path, it's not too late. Turn back, free Okinawa. It's just a brutal, brutal history. And I think the thing that I do struggle with, though, I'm glad that we're having this podcast and we're talking about it, but I don't know what to do about these injustices sometimes. Like, I feel so paralyzed.
Yeah, 100%. It is paralyzing. I think as someone who teaches Japanese history, my way of approaching it has been not quite in the exact same way that she like lists off all these facts, but I always make sure that the Battle of Okinawa is a big part of my lecture and that people can understand like the way in which she was like doubly victimized by the Japanese and by the US in the same moment, and how complicated that was and how it is definitely devastating. And that's just a little way that I try to make sure that my students know about this. And that's not necessarily going to fix anything immediately, but there's a way in which I think she has a similar impulse where she's like, you need to at least know about this.
Yeah.
And that might lead to you caring about it. And that might lead to us changing what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I actually do think it can matter. Like, you never know what student remembers that 30 years from now and it means something to them and they do something different because of it. So that's what you have to sort of hope for. You know, she puts a lot in here that she's like, you will know this because I'm going to tell it to you.
Yeah.
And I really understand that impulse. I think it is meaningful.
Yeah, I think it is too.
And also that you don't have to do it perfectly, right? Like, I have some critiques maybe of how she simplifies Okinawan history, but I think her impulse to try to make people know more about it is still important and valid.
Yeah. Nadia, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss Speak Okinawa by Elizabeth Miki Brina. I loved reading about Elizabeth's personal journey to healing. Nadia, any closing thoughts?
This book is really just truly such a loving tribute to both of her parents. And part of that tribute is that she sees them in all these really complicated ways and lets them be messy and complicated. And I guess maybe if I have a hope for how my child sees me is that they allow for me to be messy and complicated and don't need me to be one simple thing.
Yeah.
So that's such a gift. It's so beautiful what she's done here.
Thank you so much for joining me today, for bringing your compassion and your wisdom and your stories. I really loved having you.
I'm so thrilled to be a part of this. I love the podcast. I think you have such lovely conversations, and I was looking forward to this so much, and it lived up to the expectation and then some.
Oh,
so thank you for having me.
Well, that means so much, and I will start looking for another book for us to read because I love our conversations. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Babes in Bookland. To access the full version of this episode, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or support us on Patreon. Visit babesinbookland.com for more information.